Here we are, democracy, autocracy. If you keep your ears and eyes open, you'll notice that when conflicts on the horizon, we need somehow to dehumanise the enemy and create a framework via which we obtain support for the upcoming apocalypse. And the two words, the buzzwords which are being used are all democracy and autocracy. We have the Western democratic world, which includes the US, Australia, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, confronting Russia and China, which are described as autocratic countries. Now the rest of the world, the Indian subcontinent, Africa, most of Asia, South America, are spectators in this ongoing battle. And to many degrees, it highlights what happened during the Cold War period. So what is democracy? Because when you look at words like democracy and autocracy, they have particular meanings for different people. Traditionally, democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. The original democracy, the Athenian state, was a limited democracy. It was limited to adult males. Women and slaves were excluded from the decision-making processes. So what type of democracy do we have in the West? What makes it so superior to autocratic governments, or is it superior? Well, we don't have democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people in this country, or in the West. We have a representative democracy. Representative democracy is about electing a representative to make decisions for us for a 3 to 4 year period. Now, democracy is not just about electing representatives, and even direct democracy is not just about people making decisions. Democracy is a two-headed beast. It consists of decision-making capacity and access to the Commonwealth. And in the Western democracies, we don't have democracy, not even representative democracy. What we have is corporate capitalism. Capitalism is private investment for private profit. Corporations are large entities which dominate activity in a specific area. So we have corporate capitalism. Now those people who think that we are fighting for democracy, we are not fighting for democracy. What we are fighting for is a small percentage of the population owning the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. That's what we're fighting for. It's not democracy, because there's no equality. There's no access to the Commonwealth. 1/3 of Australians on social security benefits live almost under the poverty line. Private charities raise money to send Australian children to acquire a public education which should be free and accessible to everyone. We have people dying on waiting lists, waiting for treatment in the public hospital sector. We have people in our society who are homeless, people who have spent 30, 40, 50% of their income in order to pay rent or a mortgage. We have people in nursing homes which have been privatised, which are treated in the most difficult manners, as Royal Commission after Royal Commission has shown. Now, if you think representative democracy is a level playing field, think again. Those candidates who won in the Liberal heartland needed at least $1 million in order to conduct their campaigns in one federal electorate. What we have is a 1% who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, determining the parliamentary agenda. They determine the parliamentary agenda. That's why we have parliaments which seem to be incapable of tackling the most basic issues. Issues like food security for its citizens. Issues like access to housing for its citizens. Issues like access to healthcare for its citizens. Issues like access to education for its citizens. Issues like promoting reconciliation between this country's First Nations people and the rest of us. And the list goes on and on and on. A democratic society would be able to satisfy the basic human needs of its citizens. Our society is not able to satisfy the basic human needs, not because we're a poor society, but because wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. It's simple. We don't live in a democratic society. To have democracy, you need access to wealth and you need access to power. It's no accident that one of the most progressive periods in human history was after World War II, when returned servicemen and women who'd made the ultimate, his friends had made the ultimate sacrifice, returned to this country. They demanded more. They demanded a better situation. They didn't want to be housed in tent cities in the MCG and the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. They wanted access to housing. And that's what created the public housing movement. That's what created a strong trade union movement, because people had made the sacrifice and they expected more. So if we don't live in a democracy, what do we live in? We live in a corporate capitalist society where what freedoms we enjoy are not protected by a constitution. The Australian Constitution doesn't even protect us to have the right to freedom of speech or freedom of association or freedom to strike. The only freedoms we have, to a significant degree, are the freedoms which we can buy by having disposable income. And if you don't have disposable income at the end of the day, you have minimal freedoms in a capitalist society. Let's look at our so-called autocratic competitors, China and Russia. Well, they are autocratic societies. They don't even go through the pretense of having proper elections or having oppositions. And they consistently use every means at their disposal to alienate, marginalise, jail, kill their opposition. But there is a difference between Russia and China. In Russia, what we have is gangster capitalism. When the Soviet Union fell in 1989, the national resources, which had been built up over 7 decades, were basically given away to a minuscule minority who have used these resources to enrich themselves at the expense of the Russian people. And what we see is Mr. Putin, who thinks himself as another Napoleon, but this time he's not invading from the west but invading from the east, exercising ultimate power. That's what an autocrat is. In China, the situation is a little bit different. The Chinese Communist Party, after it put down the Tiananmen Square revolt in 1988, went on a different trajectory. It decided to share wealth. And what we saw over the last 30 years is the transformation of Chinese society from an agricultural, industrial society to a digital society, where hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty, but at the expense of them having any say in the way they run their government. And what we see in China is exactly what we see in Russia. The removal of any opposition. So is there any difference between autocrats and democrats? Is there ultimately any difference? There is one difference. The difference is that I can stand here because I'm totally ineffectual and marginalised and talk about these issues. But in a country like Russia or China, I wouldn't even have that ability. But in terms of devolution of power and sharing of wealth, there is minimal difference. So what we are seeing is two classes of rulers fighting each other for spoils, for riches, for power. And we, the ordinary people, those who do the work, those who pay our taxes, those who obey the laws, bearing the suffering, doing the suffering. And that's what you see in the Ukraine and Russia. That's what you see in China. And that's what you see to a significant degree in Australia. It's ordinary people who bear the burden. The election of a Labor-led government has not changed that equation. We see Mr. Albanese going to Europe, putting his hat on the, in the NATO ring, throwing his hat on our behalf with the United States. So we've really seen no change in that policy, where corporate capitalism again continues to dominate every aspect of our lives. So autocracy, democracy in many ways, or representative democracy in many ways, are very familiar. Now yesterday I saw a man on a bridge in Melbourne entering the city holding up a sign saying Russians against war. That's right. Not every Russian has been kowtowed by Putin, and not every person in China has been kowtowed by the Chinese Communist Party, and not every person in Australia has been kowtowed by corporate capitalism. Obviously, in all these societies, there are differences, and we see these differences on a daily basis. Resistance to war is universal. It is part and parcel of resistance in representative democracies and autocracies, whether they're autocracies which are based on gangster capitalism, as in Russia, or autocracies based on power being in the hands of a one-party state, or representative democracies which are democracies in name only. The fact is that in all these societies there is resistance. There is resistance to the idea of war. There is resistance to the idea that we need to slaughter each other for their benefit. Unfortunately, in many situations, nationalism, racism all play a part in pitting us against each other. But ultimately, the only way forward is for us to reject the concept of war. And many people, over many generations around the world, have rejected the concept of war and continue to reject the concept of war as a mechanism by which to solve issues. It's no accident that we see that the United States, to a significant degree, has engineered a war in the Ukraine to sideline the Russian autocrat. It's no accident that we saw at NATO that the so-called real enemy was named for the first time, which is the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. So what we are seeing is superpowers trying to extend their hegemony, their control over the world through the use of force. And that's what we see consistently. And while we allow this type of ideological nonsense to dominate our discussions and, more importantly, our thinking, And while we allow nonsense like nationalism to dominate our thinking, we will continue to be slaughtered for them, for their future, for the future of their children, for the future of their party, for the future of their corporation. And that's the dilemma we face in the 21st century. It's no different to the dilemma that's been faced by people through the ages, because through the ages it's been the same struggle. It's the struggle against the concentration of power and wealth. When the sovereign had ultimate power, which was given to them by God, they were able to exercise their will. But over centuries, people began to resist that. And it's a pity that in the 21st century, we continue to accept that ideological premise that somehow war is a way of resolving issues. Now, war is good, and it's good for the corporate capitalism, it's good for the centralised state, it's good for the gangster capitalism, because it encourages destruction. And destruction is followed by rebuilding. And rebuilding is good for the economy, but it's not good for people. War has never been good for people. It has never been good for those people who pay their taxes, obey their laws, live their lives as best they can, looking after the interests of their families and communities. War has never been of any assistance to them. And while we accept that rulers who are able to exercise extraordinary powers, whether it's through an autocratic system or a representative democratic system, have the ability or have the capacity and the desire to wage war, to promote their economic interest and their national interest, then we are fools to believe this. We are fools. And unless, like that man who stood on that bridge on that cold day 24 hours ago, holding a sign, Russians against war, unless we are all willing to hold up that sign and start to agitate against what is happening today in the 21st century, we will be the ultimate victims. Because the ultimate victims in the war in Russia and the Ukraine are not Putin, Biden, or the other leaders, or those who control wealth. The ultimate victims are those people you see every night on your television set, whose lives have been ruined for nothing. And the same thing will happen in this country